In this lesson, we'll start looking at the labor force in the United States and defining it. The reason we need to define it is because it's not exactly as if we're just saying these are all the people that are working and that's the labor force. It's a little more complicated than that. So this lesson we'll kind of dive into looking at that, and then we'll follow that up by looking at the supply and demand of labor. So what we want to look at first is labor as a factor of production. So it's the easiest of the factors to change, and this is a primary variable cost. Remember, variable costs are ones that change with the production process. And it's defined in that sense as all human effort which goes into the production of goods and services. So what I mean by that is that labor requires effort. Now, it also requires a level of knowledge, some knowledge involved within the job you're doing. But it doesn't necessarily require skill. In fact, we break down labor into two primary categories, skilled and unskilled labor. Skilled labor, of course, is labor that requires typically a further education than a high school diploma. Whereas minimum wage jobs don't necessarily require a lot of education. They require rather a knowledge of the equipment within the stores, within factories, or wherever else you're working at. But outside of that, it doesn't require anything else. Non-skilled labor, of course, food, restaurants, waiters, things like that. These are all in these hourly wage, these lower minimum wage hourly jobs, which don't require you to have huge educations, but require you to have some knowledge of the system and then have some skill. So the way we look at it is households are providing the supply of labor to the firms, and the firms are paying for that labor in terms of wages. So households sell in the market for resources, and this one labor, while the firms are the one buying. And this, of course, is the job market. So the interaction between firms and households takes place within the job market itself. So the market for labor, wages are based on dollars per week. We can take those numbers you see here and we can multiply those by 40, which is an average work week, and that gives us the hourly wage. At the bottom is the quantity of labor, is the number of workers we have. And so we want to see what happens at different wage rates. Now remember, the law of demand still applies. So firms will always demand more labor when the wages go down. You'll see it here. So as we move down the curve, what we see is we notice an increase in the number of workers. From a household perspective, an increase in wages would cause the households to supply more labor. If you were to decrease wages, the households won't supply as little. So there's an incentive involved there for households to supply labor. And the incentive, of course, is the increase in wages. So when you look at the two lines here, you can see about 1,600 and about 31. That's our intersection, our market equilibrium. So about 31 employees for that $1,600 a week. Now we can, of course, divide that by 40 and tell you how much each one of these guys is making per hour. Now, as the skills for a job increase, the demand for labor becomes more inelastic. The reason for that is pretty simple. As you increase the skills needed to work in a job, you're automatically decreasing the number of people who can actually obtain that job. And so therefore, demand kind of looks more like this. It's more inelastic. So as wages rise in a skilled market, when the wages go up, it doesn't have too much of an effect. The reason why that is primarily is because wages are already pretty high in markets with skilled labor. The problem is when we look at the unskilled labor, minimum wage jobs, the demand there is fairly elastic because pretty much anybody can do that job. But there's a lot less people that can do some of these skilled jobs, and therefore the demand becomes more inelastic. Now, from a supply perspective, supply shifts to the left. So we think about it like this, as what's happening here is demand. We see the increase in demand becomes more inelastic. We see that supply changes as well. Supply is going to shift. And the reason why this is we get this idea is that when supply shifts to the left or right, you can get an idea of what happened. So in a skilled market, supply is going to shift to the left. Now here's why. The more skills needed to perform a job, the less people have that job. So we had a market, minimum wages, and unskilled workers. That market was a lot more elastic. Wages were lower. The number of people who could do the job was higher. Now, though, you'll notice that we're in a much different place. Now we're up over 1,800. We're almost at $2,000 a week in wage, and down to about 16 or 17 employees. The reason why is really simple, and that's just because not all of these employees would be able to do the skilled labor. So this market for skilled labor is much more inelastic. So you can see here equilibrium is much different, it's much higher. Now the next thing to think about, we're going to pull these lines back up. So minimum wages also impact the market by creating unemployment. So this is a minimum wage, it is a price floor. You cannot go below this. So if we say that all firms must pay workers at least $2,000, automatically what we're doing is we're creating an artificial price. So we're trying to create equity. And you'll notice here what happens. We end up with a surplus. So basically 25 and 34. So we end up with a surplus of 9 workers that we just don't have anything to do with. Well, those become unemployment. So the thing about it is minimum wages are good because of the fact that they set a minimum wage for people to earn. Minimum wages are bad because of the fact that they cause this to happen. They cause unemployment. And so when we look at it here, the difference between these two is that's the amount. So we said that was 34 minus 25, so that's 9. Okay, so our next step in the labor force is we want to kind of get a better idea of what that term means. So there's a really significant difference between the total population and the labor force, and you can see it here. So this is from 2010. So the blue represents the total population of the United States, whereas the red represents the labor force itself. So what's the difference? Why is this number so different? That's one of the first things we want to figure out. So the labor force itself is the total number of people 16 or older who are either employed or seeking work. So that's a key point you have to understand. Automatically, we know that in the blue is going to be all of these people under 16. So all of these 15 and under kids, none of them count towards the labor force. Now, at the same time, we're also excluding everyone who is not trying to even find a job. So if you're not even looking for a job, not even trying, you're in this blue category here of the total population. So red is equal to people who have a job or people who want a job. And so that's a big difference to understand. The total force is simply referring to that red area. How many people in that red area either have a job or want a job? So not everyone in the population is in the labor force. We notice that right there. And one of the things you can see is it's almost 50-50. So excluded are people who are not looking for a job. We said that. Now it gets a little more particular though. So for example, stay-at-home moms aren't looking for jobs. Neither are students, neither are the disabled, the elderly. The military is not counted because they are not counted in this population, or prisoners. So when we start looking at it, we've got several categories of people who do not count towards the labor force. And as a result, what you'll notice, of course, is that essentially the labor force makes up about roughly half of our country's population. And that's just people who either have a job or actually want a job. So it's not everyone. And so we have to think about this term being employed or seeking work. Those are the two types of people that the labor force is going to go after. So if you were filling out an application, you're part of the labor force. If you're working, you're part of the labor force. But in other cases, you're not, and so therefore you're not counted towards that red number there, that labor force number of 153.889 million. So this slide here, we can look at the 2010 U.S. labor force breakdown. So what you'll notice here in the population of just over 300 million, of that 49.99% are in the labor force. So essentially what we're saying is that half the people in the country are not seeking employment, so they don't work, while the other half are. Now, what's interesting is when we get down here to the green, so that's the number of people who are actually employed. So 90.4% in 2010 of the labor force, so 90.4% of the labor force had a job. 9.6% were looking for a job. Now, it gets confusing sometimes because when they say the unemployment rate, a lot of people just assume that's the percentage of the population. Well, if you think about it like that, you could say, well, 10%, well, that would mean 30 million people. Well, that's not actually the case. In reality, what we're saying here is that 14.8 million people were seeking a job in 2010 and could not find one. But that, when you take that number, that's a big number still. I mean, 10% looking for a job, but it's not 10% of the population. Rather, it's 10% of the labor force. So purple plus green in this case would equal the red. So what we're saying here is that half the people in the country are in the labor force. Of those in 2010, 90.4% had a job, 9.6% were looking for a job. So that's how we break this down. So we're going to look into details on this labor, and in particular, kind of look more at this unemployment. So we will start with the labor force. So remember, of course, that includes all those over 16 that are employed or seeking employment. So this is a pretty good number. Like we said, it's roughly 50% of the American population. Now that unemployment rate in 2010, we said was 9.6%. So we're talking about 14.8 million people. So the unemployment rate is a percentage of the population of the labor force that is not working. So unemployment rate is equal to the number of people unemployed, divided by the labor force. And this is where a lot of people get confused. You've got to remember that the unemployment rate is the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force, not the U.S. population, but rather the labor force itself. And then, of course, we multiply it times 100 to give us the percentage. So remember, we had our breakdown here. Down there in the purple was our unemployment rate at 9.6%. So that number there. So we're taking that number and we're dividing it by the number here in the purple. And that's what's giving us the unemployment rate. So in 2010, the unemployment rate was 9.6%. In 2015, it was 5.4%. So we saw a definite decrease in the unemployment rate over the last 5 years. Now, what happens, of course, and you can go back and look at this at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, is that it fluctuates on a month-to-month basis. Now, remember the fact, of course, that there will always be a rate of unemployment. That's because of minimum wages creates a natural rate. So when we look at this unemployment rate, what you'll see, of course, is that it fluctuates up and down, up and down, up and down. This is 1980 to 2012, so we can see what I did here in blue. These are every time that the unemployment rate went down, while in red, these are all times in which the unemployment rate went up. So you can see the unemployment rate fluctuates in the economy, and we're going to talk about why this is, because that's a big deal. Okay. What we'll do is come back to unemployment in a couple of lessons and spend an entire lesson on that. We're going to continue talking about how we define the labor force, and that includes this labor force participation rate. So in addition to tracking the labor force, the government also tracks this. The Bureau of Statistics, that's what they do. And basically the labor force participation rate is the percentage of the working age population that is in the labor force. And it's easier to look at the numbers and read that sentence. So it's a ratio between the labor force and the overall size of the population in that same age range. So when you look at the numbers, in 2010, the labor force was 153.8 million people. Now the total population was 308, but if we take out everyone who's under the age of 16, that's basically 71 million people, then we're left with a number, 237.8. Those are the people who could have a job. So when you look at these two numbers, it's possible that 237.8 million people in the United States could be working, but of that, only 153.8 are. So when we do the math, we come over here and look at the labor force participation rate. That's what we're looking at. So what we're saying is that 153.8, and we divide it by 237.8, that gives us 64.7%. So what we're saying is that of all the people who could have a job in the United States, 64.7 in 2010 were either had a job or were looking for a job. But I mean, really, we're talking about a whole almost 80 million people who, if they wanted to, could also enter that workforce. So when we look at this labor force participation rate from 1980 to 2012, notice it fluctuates. And here's what that tells us. This tells us that on a year-to-year basis, some of the individuals who are not in the labor force enter the labor force. Well, we know part of that, of course, is just people turning 16. That would be a factor in it. But there's other factors as well. So, for example, if the economy is good and people are spending, firms are going to increase the demand for labor. So what will some of these individuals do? Well, they'll enter the labor force. Whereas at other times, if the economy is bad, they may leave the labor force and no longer attempt to find a job. So when we look at the rates from 2012 to 2015, you'll notice there's not a whole lot of difference. 63.7, 63.3, 62.9, 62.6. Now, of course, what it does tell us is it's been going down a little bit every year. In other words, more and more people are deciding not to enter the labor force. But that's an important number because the higher that number is, the more people that are seeking jobs. The lower that number is, the fewer people are seeking jobs. Okay, so I've titled this slide relationships. Really what we're talking about is inferences. So what can we infer from all of this data that we've looked at? And that's really kind of from an economic perspective, that's an important part of the job, is being able to determine what exactly are all these numbers telling us. So in 2012, only 62.5% of the people who could be working were doing so. So that means that a large portion of the population in the United States simply does not work. Now, why is that though? Some by choice. For example, stay-at-home moms do so by choice. So they are voluntarily not in the labor force. And there are other reasons as well. Some because they can't find a job. Basically, if you think about it from the perspective, when we look at the supply and demand, you'll see what we're talking about. And you've already looked at it from the preference of looking at the black market within minimum wages. Some people just cannot find a job, and so they give up looking. If you have not been looking for a job for a set amount of time, then you automatically are removed from the labor force and you're no longer counted against it. Others because they're simply not eligible. When you're in jail, obviously you can't get a job. You are not eligible to be in the workforce. The military is not a part of the workforce because they aren't, in a sense, they're working for the government, but they're not counted within this workforce. That could make a big difference as well when you're talking about the number of troops and things of this nature. So as unemployment rises, the labor force participation rate falls. Now, think about that for a second, okay? Remember, when the labor force participation rate falls, when it goes down, that means more and more people are leaving the labor force. Well, when unemployment goes up, that means people are losing jobs, and also a lot of people at that point, they're not looking for jobs. So as unemployment falls, the labor force participation rate rises. So when people are getting jobs and unemployment is going down and more people are getting jobs, the labor force participation rate rises. In other words, if we have unemployment increasing, if people are losing jobs, less people try to find a job. If people are getting jobs, more people then enter the market and try to get one as well. So there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and this labor force participation rate. Okay, so let's look at some trends in the participation rate. So let's break this down and to look at some different groupings. Overall rates fall historically between 59 and 68% in a historical basis since 1955. Now that number there for the entire grouping, you can see there's in pink, so you can see how it's moving along. The number of males in the workforce has steadily fallen, in large part because of the fact that there are far fewer males today that are graduating high school and actually graduating from college and getting post bachelor's degrees like masters and PhDs. So the specific higher level skill sets, males just simply aren't developing as much anymore. I don't know why that is. But you can see them here in red, and you can notice that trend. It's trending downward, and there's no doubt about it. Now you notice, of course, who's replacing them in the workforce, because the number of females has steadily risen. So when we look at them here in blue, we can see significantly from 1955 up through the early 2000s, there was a significant change in the makeup of our workforce in which women were entering the workforce in higher numbers than males. So women are replacing men in the workforce. And why is that? Well, it's because of education. There are more females graduating high school and graduating college today than there are males. So it's a pretty simple explanation, is that women just have the skill set that men do not when entering the workforce. Now, they still are getting paid less, which is a significant factor that we'll talk about. But just in terms of who's actually gaining access to jobs, we see more women. And that's also a cultural change as well. You actually are starting to see less stay-at-home moms. You actually are starting to see some stay-at-home dads. So there's a cultural shift that's been taking place at the exact same time that we see this educational shift as well. White workers trend with the overall. That's completely unsurprising considering they make up the largest racial group in the country. You can see them here in brown. Now, the big thing here is what about other racial groups? When we talk about African Americans, this is a very interesting trend. I drew this line across here just so you could get an idea. Basically, for blacks in America, 1955 to 2004, the labor participation rate hasn't changed much. In fact, it's almost essentially the same as where it was, and that's a disturbing trend to think about. That in a large part of this is we start to ask different questions. Is this educational? Is it racial? What's taking place within our workforce that's keeping African American males and females from gaining access to more jobs? Because if you'll notice, their number is actually below the rate across the country of all groups. And it used to not be. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was above. Then it fell below, and it's remained below. So that's a disturbing trend that, from a sociological perspective, you can do an awful lot of studying just in this graph alone. So the rate has fluctuated. It's the same in 2004 as it was in 1955. So that's a disturbing trend that needs to be looked at as to why that's taking place. So you have to think about that, and that would be an interesting thing to really study as to why that's taking place. A lot of this is going to start with education, and in terms of the percentage of individuals who are acquiring post-high school degrees, because in a lot of jobs now you have to have that bachelor's degree, and even more so if you really want to advance within the workforce. So we've looked at a lot of different things. We want to break down the labor force into in terms of categories of jobs though. So typically they're broken down into three primary categories. We have our blue collar workers. These are different levels of blue collar though. It includes these highly skilled trade workers such as plumbers and electricians, but at the same time it also includes low skilled labor such as minimum wage worker. So there's a huge variety within what we call this blue collar service or good producing category. We also have white collar workers. These tend to be educated, often they're licensed, like businessmen, doctors, teachers, and lawyers. And then we have service workers. They're both skilled and unskilled. They're both educated and uneducated. So in other words, it's very difficult today to really determine the category of which someone is in just because based off of what they do, because essentially you could be saying that an electrician is a blue collar worker, but they could be very highly skilled and actually from a pay perspective making more than white collar. And this idea of a service worker, I mean, if you think about it, really doctors, teachers, and lawyers are all providing services, so technically they could be into that category as well. So in today's economy, it's increasingly difficult to classify workers. And the reality is workers are either blue collar or white collar. They're either creating tangible goods or offering services. So you could be a white collar good producer, you could be a blue collar good producer, blue collar offering services. It just differs. So in other words, when we look at it, really you have blue collar service workers and you have white collar service workers. You have white collar good producers and you have blue collar good producers. So that's a kind of a simpler way to define in which type of jobs are available within the United States. So if we look at this American workforce, what we're looking at is very simple. Notice that 79% of the population is offering a service, 20% is industry, and 1% is agriculture from a 2009 estimate. So when we go back to that last slide and you think about white collar, blue collar, and service workers, pretty much everyone in America, we're talking almost 80% of the population are service workers. When we look at it over here, we get a better idea. This is from 2011, 16 years or older by occupation. So you can look at it really simply. So you notice that 37.5% are in this management or professional industry, 23.6% are sales and office, 17.7% are in services, and then you've got 9.3% production, transportation, material moving occupations, 11.7% natural resource construction and maintenance. So it's very easy to see where you're going to find jobs at. And the biggest location of jobs, of course, is within management, professional, sales and office, and services. There's just more jobs. So if you're looking at what type of job you want to have, obviously looking at service industries is going to give you the best idea at being able to actually gain access to some job. So we can kind of break that down and look at employment by education. By employment by occupation, I'm sorry. So when we look at it here, we still see administrative and clerical, 16.6%, professional and specialty, 11.7%. So you see these types of jobs. So it's really important when you're thinking about, okay, what kind of job do I want to have, that you understand what kind of jobs are out there. because the overwhelming number of jobs available to individuals within the United States are service industry jobs. There's just not a lot of jobs out there for people who are doing manual labor anymore. It's mainly service. So that's something important to understand.